today we have with us Charles Duhigg. I'm super excited to be chatting with him. A big fan of his work. You may know him from his New York Times bestselling book, The Power of Habit, which sold a gajillion copies and everybody probably has already read. But he's got a new book coming out called Supercommunicators, and we're going to dive in and chat about it today.
Thanks for having me. This is really a treat.
I read the book, loved it. I need to reread it because there's like so much good stuff in there. My hope today is that you can kind of give us some nuggets, some really interesting wisdom from the research that you've done. Let's just start with this term. What is a supercommunicator and what makes them so good at communicating?
It's a good question, and the truth is that you probably know supercommunicators, and the best way to describe them is to sort of figure out who in your life fits this bill, right? So let me ask you this. So if you have had a tough day, like you're just kind of like, something hard happened, you just want to feel better, and you know that there's one person, if you telephone, they will make you feel better. Like you will feel better by the end of the call. Does that person, do you know who that person is? Does that name like pop into your mind immediately?
I think I've got a few of those. I mean, I have like my spouse, my partner, my wife. She's always going to be there for me. And then I've got a couple friends that are great in different ways.
Yeah. And so those folks for you are super communicators. And you're probably a super communicator back to them. We're all super communicators at various points, in our lives. But there are some people who can do this consistently with almost everyone, right? They're the people who manage to connect with anyone. They can strike up a conversation with a stranger and they both feel like they really understand each other. They're the person everyone calls because they make them feel better. And what's interesting is that we've studied these super communicators and we've learned two things. The first is anyone can do this. They're not exclusively like charismatic or extroverts. Oftentimes, super communicators are people who just think half an inch deeper about how to communicate. And as a result, they get much, much better at seeing the opportunities for connection. And then the second thing that super communicators do is they show you that they do want to connect with you. And that's really important.
I was a little bit shocked whenever I was reading that this isn't an innate trait. Being a super communicator is not just like, well, he's a great speaker, she's a great speaker, and that's like, they're amazingly gifted.
It's just a set of skills that anyone can learn. And that actually makes sense because our brains have evolved to be good at communication. Communication is Homo sapiens' superpower. It is the thing that has allowed our species to succeed so well, to create families and then communities and villages. And that our brains evolved to be really good at communication. Now, of course, they evolved during a very different time, right? They evolved when there wasn't, not only was there not computers, there weren't telephones. And so the modern world is a little different. And in addition, it's often very easy to lose touch with these instincts that we have. But if we understand the skills, if we learn the skills that help us become better communicators, then oftentimes those instincts take over. They become habits.
Interesting.
And we get good at it.
What made you interested in digging into this topic? Like, what was the impetus for you?
It was a couple of things. The first was, I work at the New Yorker magazine now, but previously as a reporter at the New York Times, and I was made a manager. And I figured I'd be a great manager because I've had managers myself, right? I have an MBA from Harvard. I must be good at this. And I was pretty good at the strategy and the logistics part, and just terrible at the communication part. And it caught me totally off guard because I'm supposed to be a professional communicator. And yet,
I was going to say, isn't that the job title?
Yeah, it really is. And yet when it comes to one-on-one or team like leadership, I sort of dropped the ball. And then there was this similar pattern that would happen at home where I'd come home from work and I would have had a bad day myself. And I would start complaining to my wife and saying, my boss is a jerk or my coworkers don't appreciate me. And she very reasonably would suggest some solutions. Like, why don't you take your boss to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better? And instead of being able to hear her, I would get even more frustrated and upset. And then she would get upset because I was yelling at her for giving me advice. And so I started calling these experts and asking them, what's going on here? Like, why does this pattern, because it's obviously not just me, right? This happens in every relationship. And they said, well, we're living through this golden age of communication. Because of advances in neuroimaging and data collection, we kind of know what happens in our brains for the first time when we're in a conversation with someone. And we tend to think of a conversation as being about like one thing, like my day or the kids' grades or something like that. But actually, every discussion is made up of multiple kinds of conversations. And most of them fall into one of Yeah, and most of them fall into one of three buckets. There's practical conversations, there's emotional conversations, and then there's social conversations. And they said when you were coming home from work, you were having an emotional conversation and your wife was having a practical conversation. And the thing that we know is that if you're not having the same kind of conversation at the same time, you cannot fully hear each other. You cannot connect.
It's almost 0% chance that you're going to connect if you're in two different conversations. Is that fair?
Yeah. And the reason why is because when I'm in an emotional mindset, when I'm having an emotional conversation, I'm using different parts of my brain than when I'm having a practical conversation or a problem-solving mindset. So it's literally like we're speaking different cognitive languages at that moment. Now, it's pretty easy to get aligned. What's known within psychology is the matching principle, to have the same kind of conversation at the same time.
What is matching?
Figuring out what kind of conversation is occurring and matching the other person by having a similar conversation or inviting them to match you. And so, for instance, one of the easiest ways to do this is just to ask. Like, now when I start complaining after work, my wife will say, look, like, do you want me to, like, should we solve this problem together, or do you just need to vent? Do you just want to get this off your chest? I should just listen.
I've heard this as, do you want to be heard, hugged, or helped?
That's exactly right. In schools, this is how they teach it, is that they tell teachers if a student comes up and they're upset, ask them, do you want to be helped? Do you want to be heard, or do you want to be hugged? Which, of course, is the practical, the emotional, and the social conversation. And we all intuitively know that.
To the extent that I remember to do this, when I'm on the other end of the conversation with my wife, it's actually surprisingly helpful heuristic to just pause for a second and try to figure out where can I be helped? Where can I meet you right now? And how can I love you, basically, is the question. Like, how do you need to be loved in this moment, you know?
That's exactly right. And if it's an emotional conversation, we've all had this experience where we bring up a problem, where we bring up something we're feeling, and the other person tries to solve it for us, or we try and solve our spouse's, like, bad mood. And the truth is, in an emotional conversation, you don't want a solution. You actually just want empathy.
You talk about in the book, you break them into three, you give a name for each of these three conversations. One is, what is this really about conversation? The how do we feel conversation, and then the who are we conversation. I'd love to take a moment to kind of click into each of those and learn a little bit more about each of those types of conversations.
What's this really about? The practical conversation? Oftentimes when we have a conversation, we don't really know what everyone wants from that discussion, right? In fact, there was a study that was done by some professors at Harvard Business School where they looked at a bunch of speed dating folks who were on speed dates. And what they found was that most of them went really, really poorly. And the reason why is because people never asked each other why they were there, right? What they wanted to talk about, what was going on. And then because they weren't asking, when people would send signals, when they try and change the topic, when they'd sort of signal that they were bored, the other person wouldn't notice those signals. They wouldn't hear what went unsaid. And so when it comes to the what's this really about conversation, what's really important is to ask questions. In fact, we know that supercommunicators ask 10 to 20 times as many questions as the average person. And some of those questions are throwaway questions like, oh, what'd you think about that? Or like, what'd you say next, right? Questions that are designed to invite someone in. But about half the questions are what are known as deep questions. And a deep question is something that asks someone about their beliefs or their values or their experiences. And these are actually surprisingly easy to ask, right? If you bump into someone and you say, what do you do for a living? And they say a lawyer, it's pretty natural and easy to ask, like, oh, what made you decide to go to law school? You know, what do you love about practicing law? Both of those questions don't seem intrusive, but what they do is they invite someone to talk about their childhood, how they decided to become a lawyer, what they love about their work, their beliefs that motivate them every day. And it makes it very natural for us to respond in kind.
That example is really interesting because you do have a choice. Okay, what do? I'm a lawyer, to go in a lot of different directions. I typically, being on the receiving end of that question a lot, I typically hear one of two things actually in response to that. Oh, my brother-in-law is a lawyer.
Right.
What kind of work do you like? What kind of work do you do, and where do you work? That sort of stuff, as opposed to just like it's such a minor difference and not overly intimate necessarily to just ask what do you love about it or what got you into this, and it opens up such a different line of conversation.
That's exactly right. And one easy way to think about it is don't ask about the facts of someone's life. Ask how they feel about their life, right? Like, what kind of law do you practice? I do personal injury. Okay, now we've hit a dead end, right? I don't know anything about personal injury. Or my brother-in-law is a lawyer. Oh, really? In New York City? I definitely don't know him, right? Like,
Exactly.
so, but I think if you say, like, like what's the best part of your job, or like, do you like being a lawyer, or or what made you go to law school? Those are all opening doors to an ongoing conversation. And what's important is that when someone answers that question, it's very natural for us to answer the same question we asked ourselves. Oh, you decided to become a lawyer because you saw your uncle get arrested? That's funny. I decided to become a doctor because my dad got sick when I was a kid. Now we're having a real conversation, and we're both sharing. We're both bringing something to it.
In that, we're trying to figure out, what is this really about? Now, back to the speed dating example, were there any folks that did it well?
There were two main differences. The first was that they asked many more questions, and they asked deep questions, not intrusive questions, but just questions that allowed the other person to share who they were. And then they asked follow-up questions. And this is actually the sort of the second big important principle of what supercommunicators do. They prove to you that they are listening. Oftentimes when we're in a conversation, particularly a tense conversation, maybe we disagree with someone, there's always a suspicion in our mind. Is this person listening, or are they waiting their turn to speak? And so what really, really good communicators do is they prove that they have heard you. And there's actually a technique for this that they teach at like Harvard Law School and Stanford Business School. It's called looping for understanding. It has 3 steps. You ask a question, preferably a deep question. Then once the person has replied, you repeat back what they just said to you in your own words. You sort of show that you've processed it. And then step number 3, and this is the one everyone usually forgets, is you ask if you got it right.
Why is that third part so important?
Well, the third part is really important because you're asking the other person permission to acknowledge that you've heard them, right? And what happens is that, first of all, they feel listened to. But second of all, this is hardwired into our brains. They become more willing to listen to us in return. And so when you're on a speed date, maybe you don't have to do it quite that formally, but think about if you're having a tough conversation with an employee or your business partner, or you're negotiating a contract. If I prove to you that I'm listening to you, and I ask your permission to say, like, I got this right, or to say, no, like, we need to loop again. There's something you didn't understand. It changes the dynamic of that conversation entirely.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the employee conversation, and if this is done well, how validating it is to that employee, to their manager, or their to at least feel heard. Maybe the situation doesn't change at all. Maybe there's like no action that is doable that aligns with what they need or want. But if their manager can say, let me make sure I'm hearing you. This is what I heard. Did I get that right? You felt in this situation, you felt ignored, disrespected. Am I getting that right? And just I would imagine it's cathartic just to hear somebody on the other side connecting with what the root of the thing is. The issue might have been that my presentation got from first slot to third slot, and that was what that's what we thought we were talking about. What we were really talking about is, do you respect me?
That's exactly right.
And that's the way to get there.
In the book, there's this story of this guy, Jim Lawler, who became a CIA officer whose job was to go recruit overseas spies. And so the CIA sent him to Europe. And he had wanted to be in the CIA so bad. He'd worked for years to get there. And he was terrible at his job. Like, literally just like one of the worst recruiters they ever had. He would go to parties and try and like convince people to like try and buddy up with people, and they would say things like, I'm going to report you to the authorities and you will get deported. Stop talking to me. And so eventually he finds this woman who
it's like, I'm not going to do what you're asking me to do, and you're so bad at what you're doing
that it's embarrassing. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so eventually this woman comes into town who works for the foreign ministry of her home country back in the Middle East. And Lawler, spends months and months kind of befriending her, trying to recruit her. She says no. She's totally freaked out by him. She consents to have one last dinner with him. And during that dinner, he realizes this is impossible. Like, there's no way you can convince someone to take a suicidal risk by like trying to influence or manipulate them. And so he just kind of gives up, and he just starts talking about how how bad he felt about the job he was doing, that like he's about to get fired from this job he had always wanted because he just lacked something that he saw other officers have. And it was at that moment that for the first time, the woman was able to hear what he was saying, right? Because of his authenticity, because he was sharing something real about himself, because he had asked her deep questions, and when she had shared with him, now he was sharing back. That's when she decided to become a spy. And she became the best asset in the Middle East for the next 20 years.
Because he was willing, historically, in that relationship, he wasn't willing to match her where she was.
He wasn't willing to match her. He wasn't proving that he was listening to her, right? She kept on sharing the things about her life that she was sad about or worried about. And he would try and cheer her up, make her feel better. But it was only once he showed that he heard what she was saying by saying, I understand what it's like to be disappointed in yourself. I'm disappointed in myself too. When he matched her and matched the emotional conversation she was seeking, that's when she could hear what he was actually saying and realized, no, we both want the same thing for my country. We should work together.
How do we feel conversation? Tell me about what is this conversation? What are the elements that we should be looking out for there?
So how do we feel conversation is the emotional conversation, right? And in an emotional conversation, it's important to ask deep questions. It's important to show that we're listening. But what's equally important is to look for these opportunities when we hear emotions and not let them pass by. Because the truth of the matter is, in every conversation, emotions are influencing how we speak and how we listen. And we might not acknowledge those, but that doesn't mean that they disappear. You brought up the example, if we're having a conversation about next year's budget, right? That seems pretty dry and straight to the point. But it might be that under the surface there, while someone is arguing for certain numbers, what they're really feeling is anxiety, because if they don't hit those numbers, they might have to lay some people off, and they're wondering like what that's going to do to their team and do to those people's families. Someone else might be worried that if they don't come up with a budget today, the company might be in trouble, and they feel this huge sense of responsibility to make sure that they don't run into that trouble. Those emotions are there. And so during a how do we feel conversation, one of the first things we can do is listen for clues that someone is feeling something and then acknowledge it. For instance, if you start a meeting and someone says, you say, how was your weekend? I say, it was great. I went to see my son's graduation. It was fantastic. The most natural thing is to say, oh, that's great. Congratulations. Okay, let's get down to business.
Yeah, sure.
But if you just take a second and you say, oh man, what did that feel like to watch your son walk across the stage? Now you're making space to acknowledge that there are emotions here. And that means it's going to be much easier to discuss those once things get tense, and put them to the side so they don't mess up our conversation.
Does it somehow tie back into the first type of conversation? What is this really about? So if we can understand what their emotions are, how they're actually feeling about what's going on, that might actually uncover like what this is really about. What are we actually discussing right now? They may be in this scenario that you were discussing. Maybe there's a lot of anxiety around being an empty nester, and like that is impacting the way I see my future at this company, and et cetera.
Absolutely. Or excitement around being an empty nester, which I think some parents of older children also feel. And what's really important there is that at the beginning of that conversation, and the beginning of every conversation, is what psychologists refer to as a quiet negotiation. And the goal of a quiet negotiation is not to win the negotiation. The goal of a quiet negotiation is to figure out what each person wants out of this conversation.
Yeah.
And sometimes we can just ask, right? Like, what's worrying you? Why are you here today? What would you like to talk about? But most of the time, we have to look for clues. And the way we look for those clues often is we conduct little experiments. All of us naturally do this at the beginning of a conversation. We might interrupt each other to see if interruptions are okay, or if this is a more formal conversation. We might make a joke or laugh at something to see if the other person laughs back, if this is a casual or a kind of proper discussion. We conduct these experiments, and what supercommunicators do is they just pay a little bit more attention to how other people react after those experiments. And if someone doesn't react well, if they don't laugh back, if they don't interrupt, they seem to not like interrupting each other, they don't see that as making a mistake. They see that as conducting an experiment where they just got some useful data.
It strikes me that these supercommunicators come into the conversation with maybe an objective in mind, but very flexible on the means of how to get there. It seems like
Yes.
actually being a super communicator, as I'm listening to you talk through it, there's a good bit of humility in the process of saying like, this doesn't need to go exactly the way I want it to go. I need to be open and flexible, a little bit open-handed about how this twists and turns.
That's exactly right. And of course we know that good business people are this way, right? That they're fanatical on the result that they're seeking and completely flexible on the means to achieve it.
Right.
And for super communicators, what they've done is the reason why they're able to do that, and the reason what makes it a little bit easier, is that they understand that the goal of a conversation is not to convince each other of something. The goal of a conversation is not to get you to agree with me. It's not to make you think that I'm smart. The goal of a conversation is simply to understand what the other person is saying and to make sure they understand you. Even if we walk away from a conversation and we still disagree with each other, if we understand each other, then the conversation has been a success. And moreover, we will like each other more. We will feel more trusting of each other because we both understand each other. And so when a super communicator goes into a conversation, they're not saying, I need to win. They're saying, I need to understand. And that leads to all the behaviors you just mentioned.
And so even in those conversations whereby the goal is to influence them to take an action, we'll say, in some senses, we're all selling something at any given time, right? My guess is that super communicators that do this well and from an authentic place are probably close more deals, are better at the actual the influence that they're trying to create.
Absolutely. The data on this is overwhelming. That the best salesmen, the best negotiators, the best deal makers, the best managers, they tend to be super communicators, the ones who really stand out.
I'm just wondering if the term super communicator, like I almost, as we're going further in the conversation, I almost want to say it's like they're super listeners.
Yeah, it's a huge part.
I guess that a huge part of communication is listening, but like it just seems like it's so much about listening and understanding and reacting, and much less about like whether my 3 points are in the right order or not.
Now that being said, it is important to listen, but it's also important to share, right? So if we're in a conversation where we're just a great listener, then the other person will feel like we're not really in that conversation, right? That's an interview, that's an interrogation, or that's not a back and forth, which is what a conversation really is.
Yeah.
And so what's equally important to listening is to understand what the other person is seeking themselves and to share some things about ourselves. So there's this thing known as reciprocal authenticity or reciprocal vulnerability that we know neurologically is enormously powerful. If we express something authentic and the person we're talking to expresses authenticity back, we will automatically feel closer to each other and more trusting of each other. It's hardwired into our brains. It's how we evolved. And so, but the key there is that we have to share something meaningful about ourselves as well. We're not just matching your conversation. We're inviting you to also match us.
That's good. And it can't be faked. Like I feel like people's BS meter is like pretty high, and whenever you're trying to fake that, it just probably goes in a worse direction.
There's actually a really interesting study. You're exactly right that basically the human brain is this amazing device for detecting authenticity. There was a study that was done where some researchers, they had friends, they taped record, made recordings of friends laughing together, and then strangers trying to laugh alike. And then they would play 1 second of those tapes for other people, and they could detect with 90% accuracy whether the people were friends or whether they were strangers. And the reason why is because our brains are so fine-tuned to pick up on inauthenticity, which of course makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because particularly, a millennia ago, if someone's inauthentic, they could present a genuine danger to our lives. And so we're very well primed to figure out if someone is authentically trying to connect with us or if they're trying to manipulate us, which means if you do want to influence someone, if you do want to be part of the conversation, you have to bring your authentic self.
Yeah, there's no means of fact checking from some random person that's come from another tribe. You either can trust them or you can't, and
That's exactly right.
Your livelihood may be tied to that. Let's talk about the "Who are we" conversation, which this was a really interesting. I liked the first two conversations a lot. The "Who are we" I felt like was the most enlightening conversation to me.
And this is the social conversation. This is when we're talking about how we relate to each other and how we relate to society and how we believe society relates to us, how our different backgrounds influence who we are. When we engage in office gossip, we're having a social "who are we" conversation, right? The office gossip is actually very important because it helps communicate norms. Oh, Jim at the party, he drank too much. Now we know, like, it's important. The norm of this company is you don't lose control at a party. You need to control yourself. So, and when we talk about other divisions and we talk about how divisions relate to each other, or we talk about how we relate to, marketing can't get along with accounting and I don't understand what's going on there. That's a social conversation. We're talking about how these two groups interact with each other. And the thing that's important to recognize is that we have these social conversations all the time without recognizing it. And it's because we ourselves are members of groups that often go unspoken. In the book, there's a story of during the pandemic, how doctors treated patients who were very skeptical of vaccines. And the initial advice out of the National Institutes of Health were, just give them the facts. Like if somebody walks in and they don't want a vaccine, it's because they don't understand what's going on. And so just give them the facts. And
How'd
was
that go?
a spectacular failure. It was overwhelmingly a failure. And the reason why is because if you come in and you say, I don't want the vaccine because I've heard that it causes autism, and your doctor says to you, oh, no, let me just give you the facts. What he's really saying, or she's really saying, is, no, you're in the group of stupid people, and I'm in the group of experts. And the experts should be listened to, and the stupid people shouldn't. And that doesn't feel good. Nobody likes that. Yeah. The same thing happens with conversations around race, right? Where someone walks in and they say, look, you can't possibly understand X. Suddenly they're saying, you're someone who's in this group that you might not want to belong to. And that's really damaging to the conversation. But there's a better way to do this that still acknowledges our differences, still acknowledges that some people have experiences that other people haven't. And that's to say, you don't possess just one identity, you possess multiple identities. What I hear you saying is that you're skeptical about vaccines because you've done some research online, but I know you're also a parent. And I know you're a neighbor of mine. Like you live in a neighborhood that's right close by, and our kids go to the same school.
Right. Maybe you're
and
a
so
soccer
I know
fan
that you're a soccer fan, or you're someone who belongs to the same country club or a different country club. And so what I'm doing there is I'm removing the stereotypes from the conversation, because a stereotype exists when we niche someone into just one identity. But when we acknowledge the full span of identities, no one is reduced to just one persona. Think about how powerful it is to say to someone during a conversation about policing violence, right, which happened in this country a number of times, to say to someone, look, I'm wondering, like, as a lawyer, what do you think about cops? Because I also know that you are a father and that you're Black. And so you might have these different perspectives based on being a lawyer, and I don't understand those perspectives. Will you share them with me?
Yeah.
That's so much more of a positive and so much more of a fruitful conversation.
I think these two ideas connect. I'm wondering how this multiple identities approach, does it counterbalance our tribal instincts, right? I find often or everything I've read, and I've found this to be true in my life, is that when we take on an identity of a tribe, and that tribe has a certain set of beliefs, it's just really unlikely that you will change my mind unless I'm open to leaving the tribe, essentially. There's a lot of community pressure there, et cetera. So how do these two ideas connect?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the way to think about it is not, my goal is to get you to leave the tribe.
Right.
My goal is to acknowledge and recognize that you belong to many tribes.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. Because when we talk about tribalism, what we tend to focus on is someone belongs to one tribe. But of course, we all belong to dozens or hundreds of tribes. right? I'm a writer, so I belong to that tribe. But I'm also a father, and I belong to that tribe. And I also live in California, so I belong to the West Coast tribe. And by the way, I also I'm registered independent, and so I belong to the free thinking tribe. And what happens is that oftentimes when we focus on one tribe, when we say, "Oh, you're a black man, you're an anti-vaxxer, you're someone who loves Trump," what we're doing is we're denying ourselves the opportunity to find the tribe that we have in common. Because all three of those things might be true, but there's also dozens of other tribes that you and I share. And if we can shift the context, if we can change what's known as the salient environment to emphasize those tribes that we have in common, then we're going to find a way to connect. And I'm not going to have to ask you to leave your tribe, because we're going to find something that we can bond over.
Is this particularly important in this year, as we're kind of as the election cycle starts to and the hype around tribalism starts to heat up?
It's absolutely important. And it's not just this year. Obviously, this is, for 20 years now, we've basically had this increasing polarization, not just in politics, but in society, in social media. And what's funny is that a lot of it does have to do with the fact that we've deprioritized having conversations. There was a time when in public school, there was a class that you took in high school that was interpersonal communication. Teachers would teach you how to prove that you're listening, how to ask deep questions. And as schools became more technical, and that fell out of the curriculum. And it means that also, because of the pandemic, because we are online, we can get out of practice of having conversations really easily. But once we're reminded of what skills matter, it activates those parts of our brains that allow our instincts to take over. It allows them to become habits.
You believe that those instincts are within us. We just need to exercise them a bit.
That's exactly right. There's another story in the book about this guy named Felix Segala. So Felix Segala is this guy who works for the FBI, and his bosses noticed he had this really easy way with others, and so they made him into kind of this all around negotiator. He's the guy you would call if there was if you needed to get a witness's family to consent to witness protection, or if there's someone barricaded in a room. Felix is the guy who could come in and talk them out. And so a bunch of researchers at one point actually had an interview with him because they wanted to figure out what he was doing that was so special. And the researchers expected him to come in and be this good looking, extroverted, great talker. And the guy who walks in is this pudgy dude with a dad mustache and a kind of nasal voice. And they're like, "What is it? Everyone told us we have to talk to you because you're the best communicator in the FBI. What is it that you're doing?" And he basically said to them, "What I'm doing is I'm asking questions. And when you say something authentic or vulnerable, I'm saying something authentic or vulnerable about myself. I'm engaging in that authenticity, reciprocity." And that's all that it takes for us to connect.
I particularly like this section in the book about having hard conversations, which is a skill that, as I'm seeking to, become a better human, to become more wise, to treat people better, I find that to the extent that I grow in this area, a lot of other things fall into place.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about what you've learned in your research about having hard conversations.
It's a really good question because I think people get very anxious about hard conversations, and that anxiety oftentimes.
How are we defining? First of all, maybe we should define that. What is a hard conversation?
I think a hard conversation is anything where instead of going to it enthusiastically, you're like, "Oh, okay, I guess I'm gonna have to do this." It's like giving someone bad advice. It's giving your employee just a middling or less than purely positive performance review. It's that same feeling you get when you're going to Thanksgiving dinner and you're like, Uncle Jim is going to be there and he's absolutely going to say something that makes me crazy, right? We know what a hard conversation is. We all recognize them all the time. And in the book, there's a story of this experiment that was done where researchers brought together a bunch of gun rights activists and a bunch of gun control enthusiasts, and the goal was not to have them find common ground or agree with each other. The goal was just to see if they could they could teach them the skills to have civil conversations, to be able to bond with each other. And so they taught them looping for understanding. And that went a long way to making those conversations better. And in fact, at the end of the weekend that all these folks had spent together, dozens and dozens of them, they said, like, I haven't changed my mind. I don't agree with the person I was talking to, but I feel like I understand them so much better, and I feel like they understand me. One woman actually told me, if we could teach the world to do this, it would change everything. And then everyone goes home and they go online. They had set up a private Facebook group for this group.
Facebook, the place where all civil conversations happen. Yes.
Within 45 minutes, people were calling each other jackbooted Nazis. And so the researchers wanted to figure out why, what happened. And what they discovered is this. They discovered that when we use different channels of communication, we sometimes forget that there's slightly different rules that we have to abide by, right? When I talk to you face to face, I actually behave a little bit differently than when I talk to you on the telephone. I've learned to intuit that I need to over-enunciate a little bit and show more emotion in my voice on the phone because you can't see it on my face. But the other thing that they saw is that during hard conversations, during tough conversations, because we are anxious, there is an instinct to try and find something we can control, right? And that's very human. When we're feeling overwhelmed or we're feeling scared or we're just feeling tense, we want to find something that we can latch onto and control. And the most obvious thing is to control the other person, right? If you'll just listen to what I'm saying, then you'll agree with me. If you just stop talking and see things from my point of view, then you'll understand. Sometimes we can try and control others' emotions. Oh, you feel that way? You shouldn't feel that way. Like, you don't need to be worried about that.
My experience is telling people they shouldn't feel that way generally doesn't work.
No, never, never. Any attempt to control the other person doesn't work.
Yeah.
It backfires. And this is true in difficult conversations at work. This is also true in difficult conversations at home with your spouse.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is that instinct for control, it's there. We can't simply ignore it. So instead of trying to control each other, what we have to do is we have to find things we can control together. And for instance, we could control the environment. If a fight starts at 2:00 in the morning, we could both say, okay, look, let's wait until, we've gotten a chance to sleep. We'll talk about this again at 10:30 when the baby isn't crying anymore and the kids are off to school.
And we can also fed.
Yeah, right, exactly. We've had some food.
I've heard some crazy stat that the number of couple fights that happen when at least one of the participants is hungry is like something like north of 75%. Maybe just like sit down, have a meal, and then have the conversation.
That's exactly right. So yeah, controlling that environment. Another thing you can control is you can control the boundaries of the disagreement, right? There's this thing in marriage therapy that's known as kitchen sinking, which is like the most toxic pattern, which is that we'll start arguing about where we're going for Thanksgiving, and then it'll become an argument about like, your mother hates me and we don't have enough money, right? A fight about one thing becomes a fight about everything. Really good married couples, they do exactly the opposite. They say, okay, look, we're disagreeing with each other. Let's just focus on where we're going for Thanksgiving. Like, let's not bring up mothers. Let's not bring up money. Let's discuss. And the reason why that's powerful is because now we are seeking control together. Now we're cooperating to control things. Rather than trying to control each other, we're finding things that we can control as a team. And that doesn't mean that we're going to agree with each other. It doesn't mean that I promise to give up and that you win. It does mean that we'll be able to hear each other and that we'll both come into this conversation feeling like we can listen and we can speak.
Speaking of things we can control, as I was reading this section, so you just touched on what we can control together. Then there's also how I can control myself, which is honestly the only thing we are in charge of. And it did remind me a little bit of kind of like the Stoic philosophers, in the sense that there is maybe some element of being a super communicator, especially in hard conversations, is realizing what is happening to us and what we have in our control, which is how we're reacting to that and how we're responding to it.
That's exactly right. And that's an important thing to control also. That's the third category of control that we have, is controlling ourselves.
Right.
And oftentimes we can signal that to the other person so that this does become a shared experience. We can say, look, I hear what you're saying. We can loop for understanding, prove that we're listening, and then say, before I respond, I just want to take like a couple seconds to think about what I want to say. When we demonstrate that we're trying to control ourselves, there's an almost innate instinct for the other person to mirror and mimic that behavior and try and control themselves as well. And so as a result, that's how we get to civility.
Yeah.
And again, that doesn't mean we're going to agree with each other, right? We might fundamentally see the world differently, but at least we're going to understand how each person sees the world, and we're going to feel like we were listened to. And that goes a long way to making the conflict, even if it doesn't solving it, making the conflict better.
Are there any practical? So we're not trying to control the other person, and then as we get into the content of the conversation, what practical tips have you learned to be able to engage in these conversations that people maybe are walking on eggshells about, or there's like very emotionally charged?
Yeah.
Any learnings there?
Absolutely. And the book is kind of filled with these practical takeaways, right? Each chapter has like sort of at the end of it a guide to how to use these ideas in your own life. But particularly when it comes to tough conversations, the two other things that you can do that are really helpful is it usually helps a lot to acknowledge at the beginning of the conversation that it's going to be hard, that it might be uncomfortable. So just going into a conversation and saying, look, we're going to talk about this topic and it's going to be kind of awkward and I might say the wrong thing and I don't mean to. And so I'm going to ask you to forgive me, and you might say the wrong thing. And I can promise you, I'm not going to hold it against you. Like the goal here is to work through this and understand each other. And then the second thing to do that's really, really powerful is to just spend a little bit of time before that conversation figuring out what we want about it, what we want out of it, and then ask the other person what they want out of it. Right? Yeah. Think about if you start a performance review by saying, look, my goal here is to help you become a better employee.
Right.
And this is going to be a tough conversation, but like, I really want to help you. Like, tell me what you're hoping to get out of this conversation.
A raise.
Yeah, and it might be, they might say a raise, and we might, and then at that point you can be like, like we can talk about why I think that'd be hard right now.
Yeah.
But now at least we know, right? And that's acknowledging that like this is going to be a tough conversation because you want a raise, and I'm not sure I can give you one, but we can figure out the path to one, even if it doesn't happen right now.
Well, I really, really enjoyed the book, and I can't wait till everybody that is watching this picks up their own copy. I've got two final questions for you.
Sure.
The first is, what is your hope for this book? Like, what is, when you're envisioning the impact of this book, how do you hope the world is different?
Well, what I'm hoping, after I wrote The Power of Habit, I was kind of surprised by the emails I started getting from readers, and they would say things like, I'd been struggling with, giving up drinking, or I had been struggling with procrastination, or I had been struggling with X or Y for years. And I didn't know how to change. And then I read The Power of Habit, and it told me what the first step was. It gave me a model. And that doesn't mean that change is easy, but it means that change is easier because I know what to do now. And actually, I mean, over 50,000 emails from readers. It's been amazing. Wow. And I'm hoping that the same is true of this book, that there's people who read this who say, I've wanted to connect with that person and I have had such trouble doing so. And then I read the book and I saw that connection is simple, that it's a set of skills that I can learn and I can practice until they're habits. Or people who say, look, I disagree politically with my neighbor, but they're still my neighbor. I don't want to be opposed to them. I want us to find ways to connect, even if we don't agree with each other on some topics.
Yeah.
And this book helped me figure out the path to have more meaningful conversations in my life and more meaningful connections, because that's ultimately what makes life happy.
There's so much good wisdom in this book. I'm curious, is there anything I didn't ask that you think would be interesting to chat about?
The only thing is just to kind of really emphasize that we have learned so much about communication in the last decade. And the number one thing that we've learned is that anyone can become a super communicator. This is not something that like is special. This is not something that's hard. This is something that literally our brains evolved to want to do. We all know how wonderful it feels to have a good conversation. And anyone can learn to do that on a consistent basis. We just have to understand some basic skills and tools to do so.
Charles, if people want to follow, other than the book itself, if people want to follow your writing or what you're up to, where can they find you?
Absolutely. So if they just Google, I'm the only Charles Duhigg on earth. So if they Google 2Gs, Duhigg. If they Google me, they'll find me. Or if they Google The Power of Habit or Supercommunicators. And I'll mention that on my website, I actually list my email address, which is charles@charlesduhigg.com. And the reason why is because I take it pretty seriously that anyone who emails me, I will read and respond to your email. It might, take me a couple of days, but and we've done this with over 30,000 readers. If you contact me, I will read it and I will respond to you because having conversations is important, and
That's awesome.
and it makes the world better.
Charles, hey, thanks for your time.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.